Good morning. My name is Michael Lewis, and I'm going to be the moderator for this morning's panel on algorithms, bias, fairness, etc. And I'll talk a bit about the format after I finish doing this introduction. We'll have two panelists, and I've talked to them and worked out the following format where I have 5 questions I'll ask them. They can divide the answers up any way they want to. They may want to answer all 5 or divide up the answering any way they see fit. But I'll ask them some questions, and they'll respond. I'll give them some time to talk to each other if they want to about their responses, and then open up for questions from the audience, questions and comments from the audience. So that's the basic format. The topic is on algorithms and really algorithms that are associated with something called machine learning, which is a subset of artificial intelligence. And even if you're not an expert in these areas, as I'm not, I'm conversant, but not an expert. These two are, Desmond and Maria. But even if you're not an expert, you are probably familiar with some of the uses of machine learning algorithms in our society. And you probably have heard about some infamous examples of how, at times, these uses have led to problems. They're used to predict whether or not someone will commit a crime or recommit a crime. They're used to predict who should get a loan. They're used to predict who should get invited to apply for a job, who will even be looked at, whose resume will even be looked at to be considered for a job. So they're used a lot to predict behavior, outcomes of various kinds in consequential areas. And as I said, some of those uses have led to concerns around ethics, fairness, and things like that. And so that's the broad topic today. We'll talk about these things with these two experts. One is Desmond Patton. I mean, I agreed with them yesterday that they said, we won't do long introductions, but I want to give you some sense of who they are, at least as far as it relates to this panel. And so one is Desmond Patton. He is at the School of Social Work at Columbia University, and he's also affiliated with their Data Science Institute there. And that's an institute that has folks from social work, the social sciences, statistics, computer science, and they engage in data science and applications in various areas. So he's affiliated with that institute at Columbia. And his work, as it relates to this panel today, is focused on qualitative methods, but also computational data collection methods. And he uses those computational methods to look at the relationship between youth violence, gang violence, and social media. So a lot of his work draws on techniques from machine learning that sort of looks at data from social media, tweets, and things like that, and tries to relate the social media data points to various kinds of behaviors regarding youth violence and gang violence. So he looks at machine learning from that point of view primarily. Maria Rodriguez is at SUNY Buffalo in New York, and her work is focused on, as far as this session is concerned today, her work is focused on applications of machine learning algorithms in the human services, in child welfare, but also more broadly in social science areas related to social work. And she has a particular concern with not just the technical aspects of these techniques, but also the ethical dimensions, especially as they are applied in human services and child welfare. And so these are unlike me, experts in this area. And what I wanted to do, what we wanted to do today is explore some of their thoughts about these techniques, their uses outside of social work, in social work, ethical questions raised by them. And so that's what I've done with the 5 questions. And I think I have to stay here because the mic is up here as opposed to sitting down, I think. So I will stand here and start with the first question. And again, Maria and Desmond can answer as they see fit. The first question we agreed on is really a basic one. And it has to do with basically, what is machine learning, or what are machine learning algorithms, and what are some of the main ones used out there in the world beyond social work? So what are we talking about as far as these techniques, and what are some of their main uses out there in the world? So I would start with that question, and Maria or Desmond can start us off with an answer.
Well, I can go first. Can you hear me all right? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Well, first, I want to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and honor the sovereignty of the 6 nations, the Mohawk, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Oneida, the Seneca, and the Tuscarora. I live and work on the land of the Seneca Nation here in Buffalo, New York, and I offer my thanks to them and their ancestors for the opportunity to do so. And I'm also going to share with you my positionality because that informs how and what I share with you today. I identify as an Afro-Latina, cisgendered, heterosexual woman. I also identify as the daughter of 2 generations of immigrants from the Dominican Republic. My ancestors are the Taino and Arawak people, African people kidnapped and enslaved predominantly from Benin, Togo, and the Congo, who recreated their home as best they could on the land then known as Haiti, now Hispaniola, as well as the colonizers who made their home there as well. And I give my thanks to my ancestors and ask for their guidance and their protection, and ask them to accompany me here today. So with that, machine learning in essence is how mathematical formulas, which in essence allow a machine to take information about the past, analyze it in a very fast way, and then use those insights to predict the future in a very broad stroke, right? And so we can think of machine learning as there's sort of 3 general types. The first is supervised, which is very much, taking that data from the past, analyzing it in a variety of ways, generally through the sort of foundation of supervised machine learning is linear regression, which many of us in the audience might be familiar with. The idea of taking various points, plotting them on a graph, and trying to find the point at which all of those points meet and drawing that out as a line. And that line is indicative of the trends that we can expect to see in the future, right? But supervised machine learning algorithms are much more complex than just a 2-dimensional graph. So, for example, one of the most widely used supervised machine learning algorithms are called supported vector machines, or SVMs. And an SVM is actually a linear regression in multiple dimensions. So, you can think of a graph that has 52 dimensions, right? And the best way to visualize that is to think about, an X and Y axis, and think of it as a circle, right? So the, circle is 360 degrees around. And you can think of a line that kind of can go in any direction it chooses, right? So that's supervised machine learning. Then there's unsupervised machine learning, which is you take all the data that you have in general, throw it into a pot, and say, math, tell me what the general patterns are in this pot. I don't bring anything of my own expertise to that pot. I don't give the algorithm any more information other than just throwing everybody into the pot and asking the algorithm to sort the pot for me, right? And we can think about that as in sort of general statistics as like principal components analysis, right? We want to see how things hang together, but we don't have any ideas about why they might hang together. And then the third type of machine learning is one in which we're trying to actually figure out how, if we have all this information, how will people, or how will, can we predict, not only can we predict one potential outcome, but can we predict multiple outcomes, even with data that we don't actually have in the model, right? So we can think about that in sort of those of us who might be more involved in sort of more advanced statistics. We can think about that as sort of agent-based modeling, right? The idea that we know that we can, that individuals can impact data, individuals will impact the future. How might they do that? And so I'll end my my viewpoint there and turn it to Desmond.
Maria, thank you so much for that great overview. I will just add that in my lab and in the work that I do, we also deploy a form of machine learning called natural language processing, which is essentially an automatic way of understanding text and spoken word in a way that would mimic human understanding. This is a automatic computational process that is basically an extension of linguistics. And the goal is to be able to use an algorithm to take human produced text as input and be able to produce additional context and content that will look as similar to human understanding as possible. In addition to NLP, we also have deep learning or neural nets. Within this particular context, we are really trying to mimic the patterns of neural nets in the human brain to induce additional data points, to get a deeper understanding of connections and meanings in words and syntax. Oftentimes, this is used to do a couple of things to induce more data. And so if you're working with a data set and you're interested in getting additional semantic and emotional data points, you may be able to use deep learning, in particular word embeddings, to derive additional meaning. It is also used to improve the performance or the accuracy of an algorithmic system by being able to have additional data sets. Another particular point is this use of context within NLP or deep learning techniques. NLP and deep learning are traditionally not good at inducing context. And so by using things like word embedding, we're able to identify additional contextual features that allow us to have more data and to have a deeper understanding of the context surrounding a particular language set. In addition to NLP and deep learning, we also have computer vision. This is another form of AI that enables computers and computer systems to derive meaningful information from digital images, videos, and other visual inputs. And allows you to take actions or to make recommendations based on the system's ability to read imagery as well. So I'll stop there.
Okay. Am I good? Sorry. Okay, thanks, Maria and Desmond. So let me move to the next question. You'll probably notice that these questions, some of the answers will anticipate later questions. That's going to happen. But the second question I had in mind that we talked about was, what sorts of questions are these techniques used to address? First, outside of social work, then we'll go into social work more specifically. But what are some of the questions they use to address? So some of the, if you want to put it in our language as researchers, what are some of the research questions they're designed to address outside of social work or other kinds of questions? And again, either one of you can take that as you see fit.
So I would say that a major goal of NLP, deep learning, computer vision is to understand the goals and motivations of online engagement, behavior, and speech. Oftentimes, these tools are used because we have now understood that our digital world, in particular, how we engage platforms like social media, offer an environmental context, a new neighborhood that can offer new answers, unpack black boxes, help us understand our world in a different and more complex way. And so we would like to be able to understand the interactions, behaviors, and language that are embedded in platforms like social media and be able to compare and contrast them to the offline world, in particular, some of the most pressing social problems that we have faced for many, many years. So within the context of my work, that has been to explore issues of violence, trauma, and grief as well. I think we're also interested in the ability to detect offline behavior, right? And so, if we can detect online behavior, so things like aggression and loss, then could this be a proxy for our understanding and our ability to predict offline behavior that may lead to similar engagements offline? So I'll stop there because there's a lot more to say, but I will turn it over to Maria.
Thank you. So just a note that the third type of machine learning is reinforcement learning. And so I just threw that in the chat. So I would say that outside of social work, but really, outside of social work, but mostly in the real world. So I don't know how outside of social work it is. But the primary uses of machine learning are, to my mind, and based on the work that I do, sort of threefold. The first is an investment, perhaps an overinvestment, in the need for efficiency in the allocation of resources. And what I mean by that is, in general, people want to be, especially sort of policymakers, funders, want to know that the money that they're investing in programs, particularly in terms of human services, so we can think of everything from healthcare to criminal justice, education, all aspects of human service. In general, funders and policymakers are invested in knowing that a program is efficient. And the way that we thus far have agreed to define efficiency is maximizing return on investment. So if I give you $1, I want to be able to get $2 back in at least in terms of outcomes. And so some of the earliest ways in which machine learning was applied in the world was housing decisions, right? So who gets a mortgage? Who gets a particular service? What insurance company is best for you, right? That decision is made by taking in certain factors such as your credit score, your race, your ethnicity, your healthcare usage, and then making a determination about which insurance company is going to be able to make the most money off of you, and then letting you know that that's the best insurance company for you. In human services, or sort of by extension, as policymakers and program developers started to see that they could put in all the data they had into a model and get really high accuracy, meaning that the predictions that were made from the model were very accurate, then we started to think about, well, does this give us a sense of how people will behave? Can we predict how people will behave, to Desmond's point earlier? And if we can, then can we design programs that mitigate the anticipated behaviors? So here then we have the instances in which machine learning is applied to things like decisions about whether someone should get bail, decisions about and that decision is determined based on the probability that somebody will recidivate. according to the model and based on the variables that are inputted. And then in child welfare, which is perhaps an example that maybe everyone in the room might be most familiar with, what we've seen is the use of machine learning to do two things. One, to attempt to make decisions about the propensity for risk. So for example, if a child is referred to the child welfare system, what is the likelihood that that child will experience harm given the factors that have been given in the intake call? The other decision that people have been predominantly working on in child welfare, to my knowledge, is what is the likelihood that somebody whose parent was in the child welfare system will become a parent themselves and also enter the system. So this idea of intergenerational involvement with child welfare. The primary reason that machine learning made its way into child welfare, however, was the desire to try to predict fatalities, right? So what children are at the highest risk of being severely harmed in a particular home. And so I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you both. So the next question I have in mind is really more about the two of you and your work. Desmond started answering this a little bit earlier, but he may want to say more about this. But how has machine learning influenced your work, or what tools have you drawn upon in your work specifically? So that's the next question.
It's interesting because I would usually never answer this question around how machine learning influences my work, because honestly, young people have influenced my work, and young people have pointed towards this need to understand digital environments. And that then led to understanding and identifying new and innovative tools to understand the digital environment. So I would say that as a social worker, it started with people, it started with the human condition, and then that led to the tools that I thought could help me best answer some of these most pressing questions, particularly around the role of social media and gun and gang violence. As I started to use machine learning within this particular research area, one of the things that became abundantly clear was that the gold standard tools in machine learning did not work with and for the communities that I was studying. So while I had, the best of intentions, the application of machine learning, particularly this ability or this trial of detecting human behavior and emotion, did not work within a lexicon and a context that the machine didn't understand. And so there were a number of issues that would come up. In particular, one, machine learning was not good at understanding how people speak on social media platforms. And so I have predominantly used the platform Twitter to understand the role of social media and gun and gang violence. And so when we would use these tools to induce language, to understand behavior and understand different contexts, it would consistently misunderstand the various labels that were assigned to language because they couldn't understand how people, in particular, how young Black and Latinx young people were speaking online. And so it necessarily wasn't the best tool to get what we were trying to understand. But where I think there are important partnerships and engagements with machine learning is to really think about the use of annotation and human labeling with trained labelers that have domain expertise, who are from the community, that are embedded in communities, that can help the machine understand culture and nuance and context. And so one of the things that I learned as a social worker working in machine learning is that the machine is not all-knowing. It is not all-powerful. It requires our human understanding, our nuanced domain expertise in order to be better. And then there's also the question of when is it wrong to deploy it. And so these are like, there have been lots of like life lessons and challenges and complications with deploying machine learning. So it's exciting as this conversation is, and exciting is to use these tools, they can be equally as scary. And that, I think that's been probably the biggest life lesson I've learned over the 10 years of using this work in my research area.
Thank you. Maria?
Yes, thank you. Admittedly, I began to use these tools out of laziness, because because I was involved. I was doing my qualifying exam, and I had 10 years of congressional hearings to code qualitatively, and I thought there has got to be a better way. And it turned out that there was a different way, and it was helpful and useful, but it wasn't necessarily better, just faster. And I think the need to engage in faster work, particularly in my substantive areas, which is social policy in general and housing policy in particular, I think I shared some of the hopes and dreams that many people who were social scientists or are social scientists and were very applied in their work, meaning that they were invested in solving the problems that they were seeking to understand. The desire to attempt to produce results faster, to get to policymakers faster, to be able to turn around research in a quicker way, so that it could be much more impactful, I think was one of my driving desires, particularly because of the populations I care about. I care about Black and Brown people generally in urban environments, and those populations are, to my mind, the most marginalized, and also the ones who need the most justice and care in when we think about how we use their stories and how we use their data. And in the roughly 10 years as well for me since I started using these tools, what I've it's really interesting to say, 10 years, oh my gosh. What I've found out is that the people who are using the tools, even if they have the best intentions, have no grounding in the lived experience of the people whose data they are using. Particularly when my work on child welfare, it astounded me that no one actually understood the fact that in many jurisdictions, race is not self-reported. So the data that we have on race in some child welfare jurisdictions is based on a caseworker looking at someone and saying, you look like this, and checking off their box, which is astounding to me. Because then when we translate that into methodology and we're choosing variables and we see race other, right, which is generally what people might be using because they cannot necessarily identify you just by looking at you, or classify you by looking at you. We discount categories like other from a quantitative perspective because to our mind, oh, well, that doesn't give us the appropriate information. And yet I've taken part in analyses where the race variable other is the most indicative of change, is the most indicative of harm, is the most indicative of the place at which we might need to begin our intervention, our considerations about interventions that use our models, if what we're thinking about is the attempt to establish a threshold for risk, right? If the race variable other is the most important, that tells us a lot about data acquisition, data reliability, but most importantly, it tells us about our naivety in thinking that the data is all encompassing. And so I think in my own work, what I've recognized is the need for a translator, somebody who is able to speak to machine learning audiences and speak in social work audiences and to policy audiences. And that's sort of what I endeavor to do in my own work. to stand in that intersecting place.
Thanks to both of you. And both of your answers to the previous question really pointed to the next one. And that is, what are some of the ethical or moral or social justice, however you want to phrase it, issues raised by the use of machine learning in general, but also in social work? Like, I mean, we've read about these things, but I mean, do you have thoughts about what the main issues are, ethically or morally, in deploying these methods and using these tools?
I think this is the question that probably keeps us both up at night, because the ethical questions and dilemmas are so robust, so broad, and so complicated. And oftentimes, I feel like in the spaces that Maria and I occupy, the conversation is always about algorithmic bias. And usually that's about the machine getting it wrong. The machine did this, the machine did that. And that's an important conversation. It's one that we definitely should take up within the context of social work and broader social scientists. But I think that it is really the world, right? The white toxic, the white supremacist culture and ideologies that permeate throughout our culture, particularly within the US context, that become embedded in us as human beings, that then show up in annotation of data, how we're labeling data, the types of questions that we're pursuing, the types of people that are involved in that pursuit, how we're deploying algorithmic systems, who gets to deploy algorithmic systems, who gets to make decisions, how we interpret decisions, what we're considering to be accurate or not. I think all of these things are important questions to be had in this space. But oftentimes within the context of these tech companies and the development of algorithmic tools, there is this need to move quickly and to have tools that are really efficient. But I think some of the work that Maria and I are both doing are really asking people to slow down and think more complexly and more reflexively about the types of questions that are asked and how we interpret data more broadly. And so in my own work, this has been really, really hard because on one end, it's been really important to me to be able to use these tools to reduce violence in communities where people look like me. And what I know is that people are killed based on what they say online. People are harmed both physically and mentally based on engagements and behaviors online. Maybe some of us have experienced some of those attacks online as well. And on the other end, and so with that, there are lots of people that want to reduce that, want to prevent that, end that completely. And there's this idea that algorithmic systems can help to identify who the bad actors are, who is responsible, the types of language and behaviors that may predict offline harm. And then on the flip side of that, we also know that the ways in which these tools are crafted and developed are particularly focused and used to surveil Black and Brown communities. And so we're traditionally not using these tools, for example, to examine white collar crimes. We're not using these tools to identify cyberbullying on the north side of Chicago, but we are using it to focus on Black and Brown folks in the west and south sides of Chicago, right? And so I think the beauty and the contribution of social work is to embed social work principles and values and thinking and who gets to be involved in these decisions and the design of these decisions by employing design justice principles and thinking about the deployment of these tools and how these tools are used in communities and to have true partnerships with communities in this space. And so I think a major kind of conversation that needs to be had is not what can these tools do for social work, but what can social work do for these tools? And, Maria and I are oftentimes the only social workers in these spaces. And so I think it's past time for us to get really serious about technology as a social work focused area so that we can begin to hopefully change the thinking that can lead to transformational justice and how machine learning tools are deployed in diverse communities.
Man, Thanks, Desmond. I 110% everything that Desmond just said. I think, for me, what in addition to what Desmond shared, I think the thing that bothers me the most, maybe the thing that that makes me feel the word I would use is grief. It grieves me. It grieves me that social workers don't know how to code. And it's not that everybody needs to know how to code necessarily, but the fundamental language that is being spoken in machine learning is code, right? It is the instructions that we give to machines. And the reason that that's important is because machine learning, particularly supervised and unsupervised machine learning, assumes by default that the future will look like the past. And that is a fundamental error that a social worker would be able to, it looks like there's a comment in the chat about maybe an echo. So just to bring that up. But the fact that the present of any community, whether they be child welfare involved children and youth and their families, whether it be, teenagers on the south side of Chicago, whether it be, kids going to school in Harlem, whether it be, whoever, fill in the blank, anybody, poor white folks in Appalachia, right? Like whoever it is that you're talking about, the idea that their future will necessarily be their past is wrong. That is not true in the history of the world, right? Everything changes based on the present. Ontologically and epistemologically, this is a wrong thought, right? And so it grieves me that social workers aren't able to bring that into these spaces. And as Desmond mentioned, I find myself in computer science spaces, I'm seen as a social worker. And when I talk about the fact that the future isn't the past, everybody just kind of looks at me. And they're like, what do you mean? That doesn't make sense. Like we have all this really good a priori information. And this is like the fallacy of Bayesian statistics in my mind, right? And so that the fact that a social worker can't look at the code and say, this assumption is antithetical to the strengths perspective. This assumption assumes that this person has no strengths based on their present behavior, that their present has no impact on what their tomorrow will look like. It grieves me. It grieves me because those questions aren't being asked. And as a result, we find ourselves in a world where people who moved fast and broke things indeed moved fast and broke things, but what they broke was us.
Thank you both. I have one other question that you started to answer, but you may want to say more about it. So I'll ask it anyway and let you decide if you want to say more. And so that question really is, given what you see as the main ethical issues raised by deploying these methods, using these methods and techniques, what do you think are some solutions? What is to be done, to use the Lenin phrase? Is that okay to use that phrase? It was Lenin, right? What's to be done?
These are such great questions. Thank you for that. I think one is that I think within our field of social work, we need to agree to an understanding of a need for digital literacy within social work. And it's not that social work and social work scientists have not been a part of these discussions, and that there hasn't been a history of doing work in this space. There has been some work in this space over the last 30 years, but it has not become a critical field of practice. And I think that that is a disservice to our field because we live in an algorithmic world and that is not going to change. It is only going to become more prominent. So some of you may have already started depth discussions about the metaverse, where we are interacting and engaging in a virtual world in which we make decisions, in which you gain resources that is automated, that is powered by algorithms. What is social work going to do about the metaverse? What are the questions we should be asking about the metaverse? And so what I would love to see is every social work school have a minor or a field of practice in technology. At Columbia Social Work, Courtney Cogburn and I have developed a data science minor, where every student in that minor is taking a coding course, learning Python and R. They're taking an emerging technology one-on-one course where they get an understanding of the language we have used today in terms of machine learning and AI and things like that. And then they can also take any other course within the school, within the university that might be related to virtual reality or social policy and technology, or of course I taught this past fall on design justice using a design justice principles. So I think that this education piece is really important. I think we also need to get serious about inclusivity in tech. And that's something that I think we hopefully talk a lot about in social work. But who gets to be at the table? And who is identifying these bad assumptions? Who is offering new ideas, new ways of talking about the ways in which AI can be deployed in community settings as well? And a part of that is also reimagining who experts are in this space. And so what we've done in my lab is that we work with young people from Black and Brown communities and help to train and develop them as content and domain experts, and to help them understand that their lived experience is expertise, that it has something to offer technology, and that they should be compensated and treated as such within these spaces as well. But it takes resources, it takes partnerships, it takes collaboration in order to make these things happen. And so I think that there's really important opportunities through our education models in order to make an impact in these spaces. But we really have to consider this as a focal point. So, for example, at SWR, would we ever have a conference that is focused on algorithmic justice and reparations as a focal point for our conference, right? Or to have a subfield of SWR that is really focused on generating new research and innovation in this space. So I think there's lots of opportunity, and I'm excited about it.
Thanks, Maria. Thank you.
Yeah, I would say that one of the things that I've done in my own work is decided that I was going to take the best that I had based on my practice experience as a community organizer and case manager. And I was going to take the best that I understood based on my, expertise and methodology. And I was going to take that to a table, and I was going to ask other people to come to that table too and bring me the best that they had. And so what that's resulted in is as a transdisciplinary team that we would have shared a symposium with you yesterday, but COVID. So where we built a transdisciplinary collaboration. We've been working together for 2 years now. We are comprised of computer scientists, theoretical mathematicians. We're comprised of social workers, lawyers, faculty, etc. And what we've decided to do is to leave the worst and take the best. And what that has resulted in is models that are highly accurate, but are grounded and centered on justice as the well-being of the most marginal people within our data set. So we think that that model is something that can be replicated elsewhere, insofar as people are invested in justice. I think justice in tech, right? Social justice is something that our profession and our field of inquiry is predicated on. The idea that we should be seeking the well-being of the most marginal, and assuming that once that is met, everyone else will hopefully be in a better place as a result. And I think that justice is sorely lacking. I was just writing an abstract yesterday, talking about trolling in online spaces, something that Desmond alluded to and I've experienced over the past year. What does justice look like when we don't understand race, ethnicity, and gender in technology? What does justice look like when we don't bring a trauma-informed perspective to an algorithm, to the data that we're looking at? What does justice look like when we have an ahistorical view of society, right? When we don't affirm and acknowledge the mistakes that we've made in the past, right? Currently, to my view and in my opinion, we have affirmed that we want the future to look like the past. And so we've hard coded that literally into the algorithms that we're using in our life, into the way social media works, into the way housing decisions are made, et cetera, and so on, and into the ways that we assign risk to people, right? I'm sorry if you hear my dogs in the background. So I think that what is to be done is a real reckoning within our field about what we actually are, how committed we are to justice, right? How committed are we to justice? What does justice look like? And if in fact justice to us is the centering marginal experiences, if that's justice, if justice to us is mitigating the impacts of market failure, which I would argue is the function of social work in society anyway, if that's what we are actually committed to, then we are mission bound to include ourselves, to begin to talk about the fact that technology is part and parcel of our world, and is required as a form of practice, as research, and as education in our field.
Thanks to you both. That was the last question I had, and so in a moment I'll open it up for questions or comments from the audience. But I have one comment. I've listened to Maria talk about these things a lot. I've known her for a while now. This was the first time I've heard Desmond talk about these things. I've read about your work, and I knew of you, but the first time I've actually, met you, if this is me meeting you, and heard you talk about it. And you're a great team. I mean, you work really well together, right? I guess you've done this before, probably, right? It looks like that. So, great team. Love your comments. And I think I like the one that really stood out for me. I think I'm going to get the quote wrong, but I think Desmond said, it's not really about what machine learning can do for social work, but what social work can do for machine learning. There should be a T-shirt, I think. So I'll open this up for questions now from the audience. I think there are 2 microphones on either side. And you two can jump in and answer as you want to. Yep, Shenyang, yeah.
Good morning. I'm Shenyang Guo from Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis. I closely worked with all 3 of you for this invited symposium. First of all, thank you very much, Michael, Maria, and Desmond, for your excellent work, your excellent presentations, and talking about how to apply the cutting-edge approaches to social work research to enhance the scientific level of our research. I think that's very important. Really, you are all 3 of you are the leading scholars in our field, in social work field, using the advanced approaches or algorithms to address the issues of fairness and overcome the biases, reduce the biases. So very important work. And today, I think in our field, we always talk about big data, machine learning, and artificial intelligence. All these three areas, I think, are very important. I have a question for you. First of all, thank you for your excellent presentation, and really, you shared with us the perspectives and insightful opinions about how to use this new technology to address our own issues. My question is this: are we really ready to do this in social work research? How we would best prepare ourselves to use the new technology, particularly in our social work? I mean, from social work education, I think Desmond talked a little bit about that. From the social work education perspective, we are not ready. We don't have such classes. I think we offer curriculum on statistics. We have statistics 1, statistics 2, and in some universities we offer advanced statistical courses. In Brown School, we offer survival analysis, we offer propensity score analysis, right? But we don't have anything on machine learning currently in social work schools. What kind of courses specifically you would recommend that social work educators would offer to our students? For our young generation, doctoral students and junior faculty, they are going to learn more, for the future. Are you suggesting they should learn some kind of computer language like Python? Should they take courses like Python or something like that? So what kind of knowledge we should prepare? Thank you.
It's such a great question, and thank you also for your kind words. We really appreciate all of your support and being able to have such conversations. I think we're absolutely ready. I came to Columbia in 2015, and I was the only person on the faculty at that time that was using algorithmic systems within this particular context. And yet I was met with colleagues that maybe who didn't have the specific domain expertise, but were ready for the complicated, difficult, and exciting, innovative conversations. And I think that's what social work for me has always represented, that we're up for the challenge. I think a part of it is just opening ourselves up to different opportunities, to different methodological approaches. And for me, one of the reasons why I've been excited about this space is because I feel like in social work, we've been beating on the same social challenges and ills for many, many years and not coming up with vastly different answers. And I think that I have been wanting and needing to explore different methodological approaches that may at least get us closer and closer and closer to new answers. I also think that there's lots of opportunity for us to really embody interdisciplinary collaborations. And we've done this with public health, we've done this with medicine and sociology. I think computer science and data science is just another space in which we can form and foster important collaborations. What I have been concerned about, though, is that oftentimes, as Maria has alluded to, sometimes we're brought in to be the social worker on the computer science team, versus actually we offer critical and rigorous expertise in domain spaces, but also in science spaces. That is an important contribution to the development and deployment of AI systems. So I just wanted to start there. In terms of education, so I wrestle with this because I don't necessarily think that every social worker needs to be a data scientist or to necessarily have the same coding skills as a data scientist. I do think we need literacy in this space. I do think that if someone is saying artificial intelligence or machine learning or support vector machines, that it's not the first time you've heard these words, because you're going to need to be able to critique and evaluate and to audit the ways in which these systems are operating in the communities that we work in all the time. So if we don't have an understanding, we're going to miss it. I think that what we've been able to do at Columbia is to just develop those partnerships. And so we received the grant from the university to develop a partnership with the Data Science Institute and the Department of Statistics that can offer a Python lab to our students that we co-develop together to make sure that we have the right approach, the right content, and the right ways of thinking in terms of how this course can be developed for social workers. And so there's been a lot of opportunity, and a lot of this is to work with your university to highlight this interdisciplinary space and the need for resources in order to build all these collaborations. But at Columbia, it's actually been quite an easy process because I think that people understand and value and see social work as the heartbeat of the university, and that heartbeat can be translated within the data science and the algorithmic space as well.
Is it okay if I respond as well, or should we? I don't know.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, yeah, I would echo thank you, Shengyang, for those really nice words. We really appreciate them. I guess in full disclosure, I'm kind of a junior faculty member, so I have maybe less, well, as a junior faculty member, I would say that one of the things that I've been lucky enough to do is be able to kind of venture out into these other spaces and be received really well. I'm fortunate enough I just became adjunct faculty in computer science, here at UB. I don't know, that to me is indicative of, and in fact, based on my colleagues there, it's indicative of the understanding that social workers can do both, right? We bring scientific knowledge, we bring substantive knowledge, and all of those things are likely the missing piece to why the thing that you as a computer scientist are producing isn't working, right? Just because you have high accuracy doesn't mean you have high fidelity to contextual factors, for example, right? And that's something that a social worker brings, particularly one like myself, who can read the code that you wrote, who can deploy it, who can replicate it, right? Who can pull together the SQL database, who can, et cetera. But I would agree also with Desmond that we don't all need to code, but we all need to be able to know what we're looking at, right? We all need to be able to understand, the words that people are throwing at us. And I think in order to be able to do that, to Shengyang's question, that requires the capacity to take risks and fail, right? And I think in my own experience, what I found is that oftentimes, when someone suggests a coding course for social work students, for MSW students in particular, there's a lot of anxiety. Well, what if they don't do well? What if they fail? And I'm like, this isn't underwater basket weaving, right? We're here to be masters of social work. Like, I don't understand why things aren't allowed to be difficult, right? Like, I remember, sitting in my coding class in my doctoral program, and my cohort and I, literally like throwing our computers because we were like, what is happening? Like, why does this work this way? And yet we persevered, right? The expectation that things shouldn't be hard for students of social work boggles my mind, because it's hard for the people they serve, right? So, I think the white supremacist kind of middle-class sensibilities that permeate our profession and our research field are really harmful. And I'm really grateful for the work of abolitionist social workers and critical social workers who are working, to change that. But that is, I think, one of the key issues. Life is hard. Social work is hard. Social justice work takes time, right? I always tell my students, if you're at a river and every 2 minutes a baby floats down the water, immediately your desire will be to get the baby. But if 5 hours later, every 2 minutes, you're still taking a baby out of the water, somebody needs to ask where the baby's coming from and who's throwing them in there and how do we stop that, right? And so I think that for me, that idea that things aren't allowed to be hard is a real disservice to our profession because it's hard for everybody else.
Thank you. Those thorough answers, very thorough and thoughtful answers. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you for those kind words. It's really important. One of my master's degree is in computer science, and I was a computer engineer working with professionals who were designing these codes. And I cannot tell you how many times I faced issues and problems working with them because they wouldn't take a human-centered approach. And they were the reasons why I decided that I'm leaving the computer engineering field and moving towards something that speaks to my heart, where I can make a difference. So I'm an international student. I come from Pakistan, but one of the shocks that I had when I came to US was that a lot of people over here, when it comes to social work, not only some faculty members as well as students, are very hesitant when it comes to technology. And the concept of data privacy and protecting themselves is like, oh, we have nothing to hide, but your data is extremely valuable. And if you are not protecting your own data, how are you protecting your client's data? Especially with the way the world is moving. Technology is evolving every single day. A small example over here is the SSWR Clear app. I don't know if anyone noticed, we entered a lot of our information. All we do is no, 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 and that's it. And our data is being collected. So the first time when I came here, I was like, oh, I'm kind of nervous about this. I don't think this app is doing what it's supposed to do. But my data is there, and there's nothing I can do now. And so from that perspective, when we're working with people, how do we protect them or advocate for our peers to understand the value of protecting data as well as information and technology and location services and God knows what's happening with just us carrying our phones and not turning off the analytics and yet entering information on our iPads, tablets, and phones for our clients. How do you propose we do that? Thank you.
You know, I think you just outlined a subfield that social workers can specialize in a role that is needed in technology. It is advocacy within emerging technologies. Because what I've learned is that, like you identifying the challenges with the Clear app, lots of community members have rang the alarm around the misuse of emerging technologies in the community. I'm thinking about the folks here in New York City that were against the use of facial recognition systems in their apartment complex and fought back to get those cameras out of the building because they understood that this wasn't protecting them, this was protecting the corporation. It wasn't about the human being, it was about capitalism. You understand that, community members understand that. As a field, we need to understand that this is a critical role that needs to be filled out and harnessed and deployed so that we can protect ourselves and protect the communities that we work with in these spaces. And so I think that this is, if we're thinking about how do we build out this field, that we really consider the role of advocacy as a tool in emerging technology spaces.
I would say too that there's, what we need to understand as a field is that privacy as defined 20 years ago does not exist. So it's gone, right? At any given moment in time, there's at least 10 different organizations, whether they be governmental or private interests, that know where you are, why you're there, where you're going next, where you came from, and what you'd like to do, about 2 hours from now, right? So I think, and that's because there's a propensity, I mean, and that's related to social policy, right? Following, the events of 9/11, we were very much willing to give up a lot of our privacy in exchange for some idea of security, right? So anyway, that notwithstanding, I would say that part of the issue is admitting the way things are today, right now, right? Pragmatism is a philosophical foundation of social work, right? The understanding that what it is today, understanding and acknowledging how it is today is required in order to develop any kind of intervention. And the reality is, as is often the case, what will, in my opinion, what we'll be doing now, if we decide, as Desmond said, to create a substantive subfield, or at least begin to reckon with the fact that whether you're talking about a client or you're talking about yourself as a practitioner, privacy doesn't mean the same thing anymore. The definition has changed, and it is changing every day. And it would behoove us as a field of practice and inquiry to get a handle on what it's defined like today, so that we can develop interventions to start to come back to a place of privacy where we feel our rights and justice is being served.
Before the next question, could I follow up on something Maria said? And maybe Desmond wants to jump in too. I've often wondered whether or not only does privacy mean something different now than 20 years ago, but I wonder if there is there's generational variation on the importance of privacy. And I raise that because I'm middle-aged now. I have a daughter who's about to turn 20, and I often observe that her generation, their views about the importance of privacy, understood in any way, differs from mine. And so, how does that play into all this? Is that question clear? I mean, how does that play into this stuff?
Yeah, so I spend a lot of time with young people, and so I unpack this a lot. And my read of this is that young people have a very complicated relationship with privacy, in that on one end, there is an expectation of privacy, and that you will not be peering into my life and making decisions about who I am as a person, because you have this opportunity to look at my exchanges on a social media platform, for instance. But there is this need, based on their developmental stance, that says I actually need to be connected in order to survive within this digital era. And so some young people will forgo higher levels of privacy, because what supersedes that is this need to be connected with other peers. So in my context, in terms of gun and gang violence, young people will follow and be connected to their enemies, people that they're fighting with or have an issue with, because it's more important to know that the other person exists and what they're saying, versus that person having the ability to look in and to make an assumption about what they're doing online. So that's been a really complicated element of privacy that doesn't always map on to how adults and other people outside of this context view privacy as well.
Yeah, I haven't worked with youth for a long time, but I'm an older sister, and I'm older by quite a bit, and an older cousin. And as you can imagine, so I'll just bring my anecdotal, I guess, knowledge to this. But I think I remember my niece was devastated that my sister took away her TikTok. Now, TikTok is an incredibly problematic platform for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is its ownership and where that data goes, that, whatever. But, well, not whatever, we don't know. We don't know where the data goes. But devastated. I've heard from, my younger family members that it is it is not just a matter of survival. Like the number of likes that they get, whether somebody viewed their TikTok is indicative of their placement in the pack, right? Their placement in the social structure, the social hierarchy of their, immediate community. And so, and I would argue that is a phenomenon not unique to youth. I would argue that as folks across the life course cycle become a part and parcel of the social media milieu, they are also invested in belonging, and they are also invested in connection as a measure of their own worth. I think that is how we're wired as humans. So I'll stop there.
Next question.
Good morning. I'm Rick Barth from the University of Maryland School of Social Work. Thanks for a great talk. I'm also the chair of the executive committee for the Grand Challenges for Social Work. So I just wanted to make a shout out that 6 years ago, this January, we announced the Grand Challenges, and one of them was using technology for social good. And that's really what my question is about. I also teach child welfare students, both research and policy. And if I said something to them about data and predictive analytics and asked them what their impression is, broadly speaking, they would say, we have to be really careful with structural racism. You really can't count on any of that data being useful, and we need to protect against the use of predictive analytics. And that's what they would respond. And in a way, that ties in with the comment before about don't ask what technology can do for social work, but what social work can do for technology. They already have a defensive posture around this. They don't have a view that technology can be helpful to social work for the most part. In my background, when I was at Berkeley in the 80s, there was a project that Leonard Miller ran where they tried to allocate the right amount of in-home social services to seniors based on the needs of the seniors, the environment they were in and the problems they had physically and so on. And then they would say, here's the amount of hours you would get, and they would put that into an algorithm, and then the next person who was allocating hours would put in their information about the family, and then they would say, and it would come up and say, well, they usually get 12 hours from other workers. What do you think? And they'd say, well, no, they should get 14 hours. So that would go into the algorithm. So it was an effort to balance equity and actually use an algorithm to make sure that people were getting the right amount of hours in social services. And in some of the child welfare predictive analytics, it's the same thing. They're actually trying to figure out which families are not getting the protection they need and which families are getting more intervention than they need. And so it's an equity effort. And yet I don't think that's coming through, that technology has the potential to be a friend of equity, a tool for improved balancing and decision making. And so I hope that I can get a message from all of you about how to repackage that a little bit and convince some of my child welfare scholars that technology actually is useful and can be a tool for equity.
It's such an important question and concern. And I think what I wish someone would have said to me 10 years ago is that you can actually just ask better questions of technology and data, and that you need to put yourself in a context where you are challenged, where you are pushed and pulled in different directions to help get to that right question. And I think by being in community with folks like Maria and so many others in social work that are doing this work as well, it has allowed me to see some of the problematic ways of thinking and the problematic ways of deploying these systems. But we can look for strengths in communities online. We can structure our systems in a way to identify how Black and Brown people are using joy as a coping mechanism to deal with COVID-19. We can think about, as Maria's example of the upstream babies, we can think about those public health related questions that help us to think about why and how. We can use qualitative methods to drive testable hypotheses in the development of algorithm systems as well. And all these things are possible, but they're happening in isolation. I have to find Maria. I have to find, folks at Portland State, at Michigan, and WashU that are doing this really critical work in order to help me and help ourselves generate the most ethical questions here. And I think that that's a possibility. I think that there's a lot of opportunity, but we have to break outside of this isolation and really help people to identify these really important examples, like connecting people with Maria. Maria's also ran a computational social science summer program for a few years that I think is a really eye-opening program for a lot of social scientists. So being able to find those resources and connections is also critically important as well.
Yeah, and I would give you, oh, I'm sorry, Mike, were you going to say something?
No, I'm going to say, Maria, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I would, so I'll give you an example from my own work, right? So we know that the use of algorithms in child welfare, as you said, is a contentious issue to say the least. And I wrote a paper a few years ago where I showed methodologically using the same, random forest model that everybody else uses, that if you simply turn your question around and instead of asking who's at highest risk, if you ask who leaves the system quickest and what are the factors that lead to them leaving quickly, then we might be able to identify key factors that show us quicker pathways out of the system. Right, and that paper was published in the IBM Journal of Research and Development about 2 or 3 years ago, right? And I remember, and I showed it to my computer science colleagues, and they were like, "You wrote this?" And yes, I did. Several years ago. Now, part of that as a human is a little bit frustrating, but as a scholar, it's infuriating, right? Like, because as Desmond says, the questions we can ask change, right? And that entire paper is framed on the strengths perspective and person and environment framework, the understanding that humans aren't by themselves, that a human exists within a family, within a community, within a society, and that person cannot be reduced, right? To reduce a person is, again, to assume that the factors that determine their future are easily discernible based on their past, and that their present has no impact on their development, which as a social worker, we all know, having all taken HBSE, that the life course does not develop in that way, right? That it is an additive model, right? And so I would agree with Desmond that, how we can use the questions we can ask change, we can turn things on their head. Another example I'll give you is I'm actually giving a talk, I guess in a couple weeks now, at Columbia on some of the work we're doing in child welfare, where, we sat down with our team and we said, listen, the data that we have in child welfare is based on the rules that were established to mitigate risk. The child welfare system is inherently one of surveillance, period, right? The reason for that is because we're specifically looking to see if a child is being harmed and we want to remove them from harm. How do we do that? By looking, by surveilling. And so as we surveil, if we understand that surveillance is predicated on the rules that were established for the system vis-a-vis policy, if we look at the policy, can we discern the path? Can we understand how the policy impacts the outcomes that we see? And so we're in the process of qualitatively and quantitatively coding all of the child welfare policy currently in the state of New York, but we have it for all 50 states and Puerto Rico and DC. We're starting to, little by little, slowly but surely, at a snail's pace, I might add, connecting literally those policies to the outcomes we see in NCAN's data and AFCAR's data, right? Child welfare scholars know what I'm talking about, right? Those are the national outcomes that are correlated nationally, and saying, here's the policy, here's the outcome, here's the policy, here's the outcome. And if we can see that, then we can start to see, well, where is it that we need, what do we need? If we see the policy and the relationship to the outcome, then we can start asking better questions about what kind of policy change we need, right? At least that's our aspiration. So hopefully those two examples illustrate how technology could be useful, and algorithms in particular.
There's also, just for the last questioner, there's also, Maria knows this organization. There's an organization called, I think it's called Mechanism Designed for Social Good. And if you just Google them, that's the point of the organization. I mean, at least in theory, right? They're trying to think about ways to use technology for social good. And one of the key people in that organization is a computer scientist. Her name, I'm going to mispronounce the name, but it's Rediet Abebe, I think. And she's a computer scientist, but what I would call a social worker's computer scientist. I mean, she's very aware, as I think so, maybe Maria, I think you might agree. She's very, very much aware of these issues. So I would check them out. Next question.
Hi, I'm Rick Smith, Associate Dean for Research from Wayne State University. Hi, Maria. Good to see you. Desmond, I don't think we've met in person, but we've corresponded. Thank you. I have 2 points. One, when you brought up the idea of coding literacy, our MSW macro students will be required to have exposure to R and Python going forward in the new curriculum. And we are an under-resourced public university, not that under-resourced, but you know. Maria, I was not expecting you to hate on Bayesian stats, but you know, hey, point well taken. What that got me thinking, and you were just when responding to Dr. Barth, this whole vision of, you know, thinking about the future. Okay, we have the policies, where do we want to go? Whether we're talking about where we want to go with policies, but where people in systems are going in their life course. And I was thinking, how do we model that? And it just sounds like it's the difference between prediction and scenario planning and forecasting. Right, okay, so, but why don't we do that? Like, let's do that. You know, why is that so hard, you know?
Totally. So yeah, Rick and I, hang out way back when we were like maybe 1 or 2 people who used R in social work, and we looked at each other and we were like, hey. So we, the symposium that we would have presented yesterday was a forecasting of evictions in the Bronx. And what we did was we took, briefly, I'll say what we did was we took data for, we took eviction filings over 29, we went back to 2017, I think, if not a little bit earlier. I'm sorry, co-authors, John Phillips, Aaron Doler, Amy Blank Wilson, Kenny. But what we took these data and we said, okay, look, there's been these policy interventions, right? There was the eviction moratorium federally as well as nationally. There was the emergency rental assistance program in New York State specifically. There was also the stimulus, right? The federal government gave people money in basically a UBI, which shout out to Michael, who cares about UBI. And so we said, okay, we didn't include stimulus money and we didn't include the emergency rental assistance because it actually hadn't been deployed in New York State at the time that we did it. And in fact, the point is that we forecasted using multi-level models. We did some ETSs. And basically what we found is it boils down to, perhaps unsurprisingly, race and employment. And what I mean by that is that we forecasted that evictions would be 2 to 3 times higher conservatively in the Bronx had had those interventions not been put in place. And so we anticipate that the tidal wave of evictions will be significant if we don't have any policy interventions in place to address unemployment very specifically, and imperatively in communities of color. And so we would have presented that to you. And one of the critiques that we received from a reviewer was, well, you only have 2 variables in your forecast. How come you don't have this? How come you don't have that? And those of us who are informed about forecasting models know that you can't include information that you don't actually have, right? So that would be the first thing. But the second thing would be that you don't actually need that much, because social problems fundamentally boil down to race and class and gender. And we know that because we're social workers, and it's time we start arguing for that, right? And so anyway, we're revising the paper because it was rejected from the one journal. So anyway, eventually it'll come out. But I think forecasting is key, right? I mean, I think people think about prediction as forecasting, and it's not the same thing, right? It is not the same thing. Forecasting is sort of trying to see all the different possibilities, whereas prediction is, again, assuming that the future will be the past, right? And so to name just one point of difference. So anyway, as you can see, I'm very passionate about it, so I'm going to calm down and have a seat.
This session is supposed to end at 9:30. By my phone, it's 9:30. So that'll be the last word, unless Desmond has to say something that he wants to say. You know, you sure? So that's the last word. I want to thank the 2 presenters, Desmond and Maria, for doing this. Thanks Shenyang for helping us organize this, and thanks SWR. So that's it. And thanks for coming.